Hey, what's going on, Golden Bears? I hope you're well. Last time we looked at how the changes after World War I impacted life for many people in America, specifically various marginalized or minority groups. But today we're going to talk about how the depression that lands on American soil and the globe in 1929 impacts America and also many of those same migrant groups and also marginalized groups and the poor itself. So with that, there's a quote here that Herbert Hoover, while he was running for president. Now, Herbert Hoover, if you remember, was the leader of one of the World War I programs that was there to help garner all the food and collect it and find a way to organize everything from city to state to national levels for America to be part of the war event. So Herbert Hoover came with great credentials and abilities to organize, a very familiar name. And he was a very progressive in one way and Republican in another, meaning he wanted to find a way where we can blend together both government, the Republican mindset with laissez-faire, hands-off approach, but with more of a progressive thing where how about we both find a way to work together collectively. And so here he is in his speech where he's arguing for this idea of rugged individualism, that we all should take a place in society and individually reflect on how we can help to the greater cause. JFK made this type of concept famous in his speech when he won presidency. But for right now, let's focus on Herbert Hoover. I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering. The lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people. But we're going to find out how America and people during this time had judged him, and ultimately not so favorably because of his lack of response of sorts. This is your graphic organizer for the week. Be sure to pay attention to the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. That will happen when we get to 7.9. Well, my story starts with this little nondescript corner of goodness. You might not look at me now and think that, Steger, what? This guy actually knows how to surf? But there was a time that I would surf almost every weekend, make long week-long trips surfing, and just really enjoyed it. But as family came and lifestyles changed, I kind of had to put certain hobbies away to pick up different hobbies. But one such time I was invited to go down to Mexico. The year was 92, 93, and they're going, Steger, we're going to go to Scorpions Bay. I'm like, okay, cool. What's involved? Just take some food, take some surfboards, and we just need to know that it's going to be rustic and rural. And so sure enough, I mean, it was like probably a 16-hour trip all the way down there on mostly paved road, down 2-lane road down to where did it go? It's not that important, but quite a ways south. And then from there, we had to travel by dirt road by about 5.5 to 6 hours. And some of it through salt marshes that we didn't know if we get stuck or not. Quite the adventure. So there we land in 92 on this remote point, and it is firing. It is beautiful. Nice waist to shoulder high waves that just peel forever and ever and ever and ever. We're like, woo, woo, woo. We hit this thing for like 2 or 3 days straight, and then all of a sudden the wind machine and the wave machine stopped, and we had 2 days of literally nothing going on there. But for us, we thought, this is why we came to Mexico. There were a few other surfers that showed up that we arrived. When we arrived, there were some there that left, and there were some that were coming in after we did. It was kind of a cool thing, but there was nothing on the bluffs. There was, in fact, one lady that was around, what we would know is about 9 or 10 blocks away, that she basically cooked little tacos out of her back of her bed of her truck, and that's what the local taqueria was like. Well, this last year, I had the privilege of going down with a bunch of friends to the same place, and oh my goodness, it is though it has been transformed. They're actual legit homes that some of them might rival some Orange County type of homes, and people have built their own sense of paradise. There's some paved streets, there's cell service, there's electricity, there's a restaurant out on the point now that you go to. I was like, wow, I guess I should have been coming back a little bit more often, or maybe should have bought my piece of paradise back in the day. And you say, Steger, why are you talking to us about this? Well, it's American story as well, is that America is going to go down to basically zero, and every part of our culture and our society is going to feel the ramifications of this global depression. And it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of industrial energy, a lot of government involvement in order to build up our economy to become industrialized again and functioning. And it's going to take a good almost 11 years before that to take place. So with that, I leave you on the Scorpion Bay, and if you're a surfer, go look them up on YouTube. You will be impressed. You won't find me out there surfing, but you'll certainly see some cool spots. So with that, let us dive into the Great Depression. Well, there's this thing that you heard about called the Black Tuesday, where in October of 1929, it had finally caught up to them. America's living on credit and buying stock on credit had finally happened. But that isn't what caused the Great Depression. You need to recognize there were many factors that caused the Great Depression, not just this thing that triggered, first we need to recognize that there was a huge disparity of wealth between, the titans of industry to those who were the lowest of low and those who were often either marginalized or minorities. There was inadequate consumption, meaning people weren't buying as much as they could have. In terms of that, the American model was everybody should be buying a toaster every third year and a car every third year and all these things. But after time, there becomes a saturation point in America that everybody's bought what they need. And if I don't keep buying toasters every 3 years, the factory will have a problem. And that's part of the reason why we had to turn to, what we talk about with this idea of imperialism that I'll talk about in future sessions, where we have to look to outside of America to go sell those types of things. Another aspect, so number one is disparity of wealth that was happening there. Another one is inadequate consumption. That was something that triggered it. A third thing is too much credit, both at home and abroad. And that America owed a lot of money to foreign countries. And from World War I, they owed us a lot of money at this time. And then another thing is that the government was unwilling to help out the farmers who were over in debt and incapable of expanding fast enough, and then also creating the prices high enough to where it's worth their time. So it was just not just one thing that did it. It was a multitudes of things. And then to compound it even first, you have a new president, Herbert Hoover, who's basically saying, hey, it's the job of the individual to try and solve their problems. And what does he do? He kind of immediately has the government do kind of the opposite of what you'd think. He basically lowers taxes on the wealthy, and he cuts and raises tariffs on manufacturing goods, so that way, Americans might be able to protect jobs, etc. Well, all that does is cause other countries to raise tariffs on our goods, so we can't sell our things anywhere. It was just a recipe for disaster in every measure, as you can see. Well, this depression had a global impact, and President Hoover didn't have a clear idea how to do it. And as he continued to try and make some changes, he kind of kept, bungling his steps. He did try to help the farmer with the Agricultural Marketing Act, but what this did is it inflated prices, and it didn't have the result that they wanted to in terms of with the government buying back their surpluses of this. He then, said volunteerism should take place at the local level, and he recognized when prior downturns in the economy happened in, let's say, in 1893 when the last one took place, he recognized that local communities and local municipalities took care of the people. Well, in this situation, we have over 133, I believe, 133,000 municipalities that had declared bankrupt during this time. So if municipalities were bankrupt, namely like the city government of Temecula, how can they care for those people in their own neighborhoods? And continuing on, we have Hoover trying to continue to allow the American business people to drive what was best. And it was during this time that Hoover recognized that his policy of laissez-faire, while at the same time being progressive, needed to have a kick in the pants. And it is there that this do-nothing president that people were calling him, this do-nothing president that was not being active enough in the local regions and the counties and the states, he began persuading Congress to lower income taxes and begin using public monies to kind of build projects. It was called the RFC. And so this RFC, which I'll talk about in subsequent things, basically was a means and a measure for government to begin creating jobs and opportunities for Americans and American farmers. So what was interesting, however, is that despite his attempt to curb the deficits and to curb unemployment, he kind of saw that this trickle-down theory that was supposed to work was not working. And in fact, as he raised taxes on the wealthy this time in trying to respond back, he discovered that, you know, the trickle-down theory had stopped, and those companies were closing down. The wealthy weren't able to give as much as they were. And what did this in turn result with? A leading cause of greater unemployment. Not good time to be Herbert Hoover, to be the same. And then he passes the Hawley-Smoot Act, which again raises tariffs on even agricultural goods this time to try and protect American farmers. Well, what does this do? It keeps American farmers from selling overseas as well. It has just been a troubling time. So the president goes through and he does this RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Essentially, he offers money, federal money, to banks and large railroad companies and large insurance companies to help them maintain their solvency. Now, this works for the most part, but what it doesn't do is help the small-time business and the small-time person that might not have the best of credit. And those, sadly, were the ones that needed to be reached the most. And so this RFC idea was good in its concept. It didn't help the average Joe keep their job or keep their business, and thus by keeping their business, keeping their employees in with jobs, etc. So ultimately, we have a president that didn't meet the needs. He's known, as the guy that does nothing. He then has, what's happening in the local cities take effect. Different people who own the buildings in all the major cities across America are now beginning to kick the people out who can't afford them. We're talking, the dead of winter, and people in New York who can't pay their bills, can't pay rent. They're being booted out and having to go live in tents. And they essentially go start these areas called Hoovervilles, named right after, Herbert Hoover. These Hoovervilles stretch from anywhere from Stockton to Seattle to New York to Chicago. Basically, if there's open space, that's where these entire families would go. And this is where, the newspaper and the media just found an easy scapegoat in President Hoover to blame for these things. Although, he was working hard to try and fix them, it just wasn't happening at a pace that it should have been done. And at the last thing that we have going on, you can talk about the worst case scenario for this guy. He has the farmers that he's trying to help and protect are having probably one of the most worst ecological disasters in America in some time with regard to the perfect storm. You have farmers that are riddled in debt and can't pay the banks their money. You have cities that don't have the money to buy the crops even if they did have them. And then you have a drought emerging there across this, as you can see in the picture in front of you. And this drought triggers the erosion, and this erosion then gets picked up by the wind, and then it carries it for miles upon miles upon miles. And what was this a result of? Of farmers not understanding ecological sciences behind it, and a government not forcing them to learn those and adopt those patterns. What did this? It was eventually the use of wheat, because wheat was the best product that they had that they could sell both locally and primarily overseas. And so they had depleted the soil of all its essential nutrients and ingredients, and that created a problem in of itself. What did it create? A group of people known as the Okies. They're going to go out and try and get jobs elsewhere. Notice they're not all from Oklahoma, but that was just a convenient name, and I'll be talking about them in subsequent lessons. Well, not only were almost every people group, predominantly white people, affected, we're going to now take some time to look at how were different minorities experiencing these challenges. You need to recognize that almost every minority group were the last hired and first fired. That has been the situation long part of American history. And sadly, it's sometimes it still even plays out to this day. Well, in the South, the African American communities were typically sharecroppers and tenant farmers who weren't able to pay their debts that they had. If you remember, they were beholden to the land and working for the land owner who would let them keep a share of the crop, but they had to often take out loans to do these things. And as the falling crop prices occurred, they weren't able to pay back the loans, and so they were tied to the land. Yet, while living there, they experienced the Jim Crow laws, and they continue to listen and experience the challenges of a racist society there in the South. And tensions were high all over the place, not just in the South, but also in the North. And one such thing is that of the Scottsboro Nine as evidence of these surroundings. And basically, the Scottsboro Nine were two men were traveling. I'm sorry, a group of men, about 4 or 5 of them were traveling on a train, and then it stopped again. A few more got on. And at the same time, there were 2 young girls who were, I don't know if they were running away from home or if they were just fleeing their home because there's no opportunities there. They got on the train around the same time, all of them not paying. And as the plane came to the station, through circumstances that are still perplexing and confusing, these 2 white women accused the men of raping them. And so what happened is there was a trial. All of the men, all 9 of them, were found guilty and by a local jury there in Alabama, and they were summoned, to death. The Supreme Court intervened and basically said they were never given the right of a fair trial. A few years later, the trial was held. They were still found guilty of that, but they were subsequently 5 of them were released because they'd already served time. The other 4 were not given much of a sentence as well. And so what you need to recognize is that this is a typical experience of the tensions and the racism that were flowing through the South, and is more reason why people were anxious to get out. Here's another picture that you can see here, is that it says slavery was abolished, yet we work for much less than their counterparts. And that is sad, that in fact some sharecroppers in the South are barely making $200 a week when they're making almost 4 times that working in the factories up in the cities. So here's a picture of the 9, Scottsboro 9 it was called, that were look how young they were and are, and where the judicial system did not protect them by any means, and there they are with their one lawyer to try and get them out and keep them from going into prison and dying. Now let's turn our attention to the Mexican Americans and the Spanish-speaking Mexicans who are living mostly out on the West Coast, who were brought in under various government programs to work in the fields and to work in the factories. But during the Depression, and here's something you probably don't know and isn't made known by your media, and then our last, President 45, Trump, he was bashed for continually building the wall and keeping various minority groups out. But did you know that under FDR, under a progressive president, under a time when, changes were rampant, most people don't identify that FDR and Herbert Hoover actually sent more Mexicans away in the name of securing jobs than President Trump, number 45, and others had up to that time. And so I just want to be mindful of you. That's why we like to study history and keep a wider perspective to this, is that the ebb and flow and the convenience of the ebb and flow of history often has dramatic influences. And so, again, there were some people, Mexican, who were Mexican Americans born here, who were forced to be deported down to Mexico as well, or they simply left because there was no jobs up here and they knew they were experiencing tremendous harsh treatment. Why were they being booted out? Simply because those jobs are needed for white people to go work in the fields. And that was the government policies as determined by Hoover and FDR. How about for the Asian American, Japanese Americans? Again, they're not allowed to own land, although they're allowed to be here. They experienced tremendous amount of hardships and persecutions during this time. The same thing for the Chinese Americans and the Filipinos. Even though the Filipinos, based on the tidings of McDuffie Act, and given the opportunity of liberating all of the Philippines from American control, nope, they had deep prejudices simply because they looked differently or talked differently or had different cultural values here in America. Here's a great picture of a migrant worker right outside our backyard, theoretically, right out there in the Imperial Valley. This is probably somewhere near where the Salton Sea was, and you can see the little girl here in the corner. You can see the gentleman here holding the baby. We don't know where the mama is, but incredibly rustic thing. The name you need to be mindful of, and we'll try and revisit her. Her name is Dorothea Lange, and she is hired by the American government under the WPA program that we'll talk about in the next chapter to go and capture what it's like to be living in America for those who are downcast and downtrodden. And so Dorothea Lange, her work often shows up on these AP exams, so please be familiar with her as she highlights the life of Americans. Well, as we now continue to kind of turn to financial strain and organized protest, we're going to begin seeing how the strains are affecting everyday homes. And interestingly enough, more men were unemployed, leaving stay-at-home wives to have to go out and actually gain more support. So often it's weird that the husbands lost their jobs in the factories or doing those manly work, whereas the women might have become more of a breadwinner. And this shows a greater change during this time period as well. And we also recognize that there's a huge disproportion of marginalized people groups that are unable to hold jobs. So let's say if 25% of the male population who are white can't hold a job, that would be well over 40+% of them if they were African American, if not higher. Some areas over 75% of the African Americans could not hold work simply because of prejudice and strain in that way. Now, there were some examples of how there was organized protest for the government and their lack of involvement of this, okay? And one of them happened outside of Iowa. I think it's not Des Moines. It's a small town called Grand, I forget. It's a small part along the river, but nonetheless, this farmer began to recognize if we're ever going to get prices increased, we need to reduce how many of our products are hitting and flooding the market. So with that, he encouraged farmers in the area to do a farm holiday association where they said, all right, for the next 2 or 3 days, don't send any of your products to the market. Interestingly enough, some got violent when others tried to break that deal they had arranged. And, they didn't ultimately reach their goals, but you do need to recognize that there were Americans who were trying to find ways to protest what was going on for a lack of government involvement nor care and concern in their life. And getting close to, there's another interesting story that has parallels here to Coxey's Army. If you remember, we talked about there was a time when Coxey was out of Philadelphia, and he was trying to lead a group of men to go and have the government give them some money that was owed to them from their service in the, if I'm not it's the Civil War. And so here we have a very similar thing at the Bonus Army. So here we have a group of men who were promised, I think, $1,000 as a pension from serving in the war, World War I. They're like, yo, dude, I might even make it through this winter. I want to have my money now because that $1,000 pension will help do X, Y, and Z for my family. And so this one started out in Portland area, I believe, out in I don't know which exact area of Oregon, but it led to where almost 20,000 people and their families landed there in D.C. And interestingly enough, while they're there camped out in D.C., two famous war heroes from World War II are going to be called upon. We're going to have General Patton, and we're going to have Douglas MacArthur, who will discover them in subsequent chapters. But they're going to be called upon by the president to go and get rid of these troublemakers. Remember, these are vets that fought in World War I who are now being disbanded by the current, FDR Hoover And because Hoover refused to negotiate with him, this was seen as just another example of his inability to understand and be part of people's journey and the struggle that they had. So in summary of this, we need to be mindful that this Great Depression not only shook Americans' confidence, but it shook their understanding and capacity to think that capitalism would help them out of this economic prosperity, leading them to turn to the government for their solutions.